One of the interesting parts in being in ministry for a long time is you see things go off the rails a fair number of times, and you end up with some very interesting stories. I used to work with somebody who had come of age in the 70s, and if I ever wanted to get him going and just waste a half an hour, I would suggest to him that we should do a clown service. Because back in the day, the clown services were a thing, and he would go on this 20-minute rant about clown services. It was cheap entertainment in my mind. Him ranting, not clown services. I'm not going to make any judgments one way or the other there. But over the years, I've seen a number of bad worship services. I remember in particular, once when Lorianne and I were dating, we went to this place called Spirit Garage. What it was this established Lutheran church, very smart Lutheran church, had said, we want to reach Generation X. And for those of you, I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, Generation X, were they ever a thing? Are they still a thing? Yes, we still exist. Get off my yard, okay? Yeah. Anyway, so Bethlehem Lutheran had said, we're going to create this place. And it's going to be cool, and it's going to meet in a black box theater in downtown Minneapolis, and we'll very artsy, very hipster. It'll be really fun. And so they said, we'll call it Spirit Garage. And so Lorianne and I heard about it. We went one Sunday morning, and they had a guest preacher in. And this guest preacher was beyond artsy. I don't know whatever. When you cross over artsy into the other side, that's where she was. And she was doing this thing where she had this giant rope circling around the space, and it signified time, and back to the Big Bang, and 1 millimeter equaled 1 year, and so on and so forth. And then people arrived, and there were finger puppets, and at one point Jesus arrived as a finger puppet, and they crucified a finger puppet, and God is my witness, I hope I never see another finger puppet crucified in my life, okay? Still have the nightmares. At one point, the woman next to Lorianne couldn't tell, is she laughing or crying? And it's like, no, she's laughing. She's just trying to contain it. And we all kind of walked out of there like, what was that? But so often we get worship and it just goes awry. And we forget what the priorities are. One time when I was learning how to be a pastor, I was in seminary and I was working at this church up in northern Minnesota. And I was doing basically the assisting ministry parts that Sunday morning. And so at one point the ushers bring the offering forward, and they hand me the offering plates, and I turn around and I put them here on the altar. And I sit down, and the senior pastor leans over to me and he says, Mike, we don't put the offering on the altar. We don't worship the money. And I look over at the altar, and they've got one of these giant brass stands. And on that giant brass stand is this giant hymn book. And it's huge, and it's got the gilded edges all the way around. And I look up at that and say, you're right, John. We don't worship the money. We worship the hymn book. Oh, I got the dirtiest look that morning. I will fully admit that I was not the most mature then, and yeah, I kind of deserved that look. But I tell you all those because what often happens is we get confused over what we're worshiping, and we get confused over our place in worship. And we try and be relevant, we try and be cool, or we try and be tradition, or we try and worship these things, and we get confused about who we're worshiping versus what the hymn book or those other things point to. And we get lost in the process. And we think it's about us. And we think about our preferences, our desires, our hopes. And so what I want to do is I want to go back. I want to go back 3,000-4,000 years in history and look at how this all evolved. See, we're walking through the Bible, and now we're on to Solomon. And 3,000 years ago, Solomon becomes king. And what happens is Solomon is going to build the temple. The people of God, what they had been doing is when they came out of Egypt and went through the wilderness, they built the tabernacle. There was the Ark of the Covenant, which has the 10 Commandments in. And if you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know what we're talking about. And that ark was housed in what was known as the tabernacle. And it was this tent and a fence around it. And they would bring it all the way through the wilderness. And when they got to Jerusalem, they parked it in this one particular spot. And that spot was not just any spot. It was the spot where God had said to Abraham 1,000 years before Solomon, this is where you're going to make this sacrifice, on this stone, on Mount Moriah, which is sometimes now called Mount Zion, but that spot, okay? And so when David shows up, he says, okay, we're going to build the temple here. God says, this is where we want to build the temple. And he buys this threshing floor, this particular place. It says, this is where we're going to build it. And God says to David, you're great, but you're not going to be the one to build the temple. Your hands are too bloody. It'll be your son who builds the temple. So when David dies due to old age, Solomon inherits the kingdom, and it's peaceful and prosperous, and the borders have been pushed out, and the enemies are weak and disorganized. And so God says, now is the time you build the temple. And that temple is built on that same spot that God had showed Abraham 1,000 years prior, and you can still go there today. It is this spot where Solomon built the temple, the first temple. When the Babylonians destroyed that temple, the Israel people rebuilt it. It's expanded in the time of Jesus under Herod the Great, destroyed again by the Romans, but you can still go there. And I have to tell you, when I got to go to Israel back in 2017, one of my favorite parts of that trip, one of the most meaningful parts of that trip, was making the pilgrimage to what's called the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. Sure where that was, is this retaining wall of where the Temple Mount is built. And they've got these huge stones making up this wall. And the tradition has been for generations to go and write your prayers down and put it in the cracks of those walls. And so to go there and to make those prayers and put that in there, and knowing that literally tens of millions of people had come before me, and however many more millions of people would come after me, was this incredible, meaningful experience. Because seeing where it was, there's absolutely no illusion that anything about me matters. It was knowing I was part of this tapestry of believers in this spot, stretching back to Abraham. Go ahead and put that first slide up there. Solomon gathers the whole nation of Israel, and he dedicates the temple with this beautiful prayer. The Lord our God be with us. He was with our fathers. May he not leave us or forsake us, that he may incline our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways and keep his commandments, his statutes, his rules, which he commanded our fathers. I love this beautiful imagery. See, what Solomon is doing, he's reminding us of where we fit in things. The reason we get confused, the reason we get so frustrated is we think it's about us. And when we go to worship, we are reminded it's not. It's not about us. It's not about our desires. It's not about our preferences. It's about God. And so Solomon is saying, yeah, let's be here. Let's worship in this place. Pray that God doesn't leave us, and worship out of gratitude. Solomon is doing this thing where he's remembering everything that's happened, and he's being grateful to God. Solomon watched his father deal with all this stuff, deal with plagues, civil wars, insurrections, invasions, all this stuff. And he knew the stories about Saul, the first king of Israel, having the Holy Spirit taken away from him. And so what Solomon is really saying is we need to remember God comes first. And when we worship God, what it does is it puts our life in order. It says to us, hey, God comes first. How many times have we been in that spot where we get so frustrated over this, and we just keep this laundry list of things that are driving us crazy? What worship does is it resets all those expectations. And it lets us let go of those things and come back to the beginning. Come back to God's love. Come back to seeing him at the center of stuff. And not focused on our own needs, our own hurts, our own angers, our own issues. And saying that God comes first. Now, there's two other interesting little pieces that I want to pull out of this. The first is the passage we just heard read for us. Talks about all these animals slaughtered. The parallel passage out of Chronicles says that there was 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep that they slaughtered. It was a lot of meat. That's a lot of meat. The way they would do it back then is what you do is you bring the animals into the temple courtyard. The priests would ritually slaughter them. You would burn up parts of the animal, and then you would cook the rest to feed the people. And so they gathered the whole nation of Israel there, and they feasted for this week-long worship service. And it was a celebration of what God had done and how much that God loved them. Now, I want you to think about this. A lot of times, particularly when I'm working through the New Testament, I will try and translate the money into some terms that we can do. Usually with like denarii, which is a day's wages, you can come up with a rough approximation of how much this means in today's money. But 22,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep, I got no words for you. I mean, that's like Jeff Bezos times 50. I mean, that is just some crazy, absurd amount of money that just doesn't make sense to us. But I want you to think about why Solomon does this. It's not because he's trying to impress God. It's not because he's trying to impress the people. He's doing this out of gratitude. I had one of these conversations on Wednesday. I had been feeling kind of like, you ever have those weeks where you just feeling nibbled to death by ducks? And it's like just the little stuff keeps getting at you. Okay, apparently I'm the only one. I'm used to this. I just work out my issues up here. You guys are all perfect, okay? You just use this as an example of how not to live. That's fine. I'm okay with that. But I felt like I was getting just nibbled to death by ducks. And I was having this conversation Wednesday. And we were talking about stewardship and giving, and somebody says we need to remember that we give out of gratitude. And I'm like, oh, that's right. I knew that. It was one of those things I knew, but I needed to be reminded of. And that's what's going on with Solomon. He's giving this to God out of gratitude. Not out of, I want to show everybody, but I need to remember, because Solomon had dealt with all this stuff, and he had seen his father deal with that, and he had seen Saul deal with that. And he's like, I'm good. I'm in a place where the kingdom is doing well. The kingdom is prosperous and at peace. I want to give and say thank you to God. That's what he's doing there. That's what he's showing. He's saying, God, because you have done these amazing things for me, I want to say thank you. And that's why we give. We don't give to keep the lights on. We don't give to pay the mortgage or the insurance. We give because we are thankful to God's vision. We give because we want to be a part of what he's doing here in this world. And I want you to remember that and think about that. There's one last piece I want to show you. If you could throw that next slide up. We have this amazing collection of Hebrew poetry and songs. It's known as the Psalms. And the people of Israel at different points in different places would sing different things. And there were certain songs that were traditional for going up to the temple. And Psalm 100 is one of these. Enter his gates with thanksgiving. Enter his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. The whole of Psalm 100, it's only 5 verses long. But it's these 5 beautiful verses, and it's meant to be sung. And I want you to think about that for worship. Sometimes we treat worship as this obligation, like, I got to go to worship. And I remember when I was a kid, we always used to go to early church, like 8 a.m. early. I remember, you'd wake up in Minnesota and the sun doesn't come up till 11:30 in the winter. And you're like, I got to church. But what we see biblically is that we are called to worship with joy. Now, does that mean that you just show up and you have to pretend to be happy? No. There are plenty of psalms talking about our pain and our sorrows and our suffering. But what this is a reminder that we are called to worship with joy. There's a reason I open up every worship service with that psalm. This is the day the Lord has made. We are going to rejoice and be glad. It is a reminder that whatever sufferings and sorrows that we go through, and I'm not denying any of those, I am saying that God has made us joyful because we have been redeemed by what he has done. We have been given a new life and given a new hope in what he has done for us. And so I hope as we go forward, I hope you can look back at Solomon and see this new thing that God did there and how that thing stretches from that time 3,000 years ago to today, and that we worship because of what God has done for us. Amen.